Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Thom Yorke and Stanley Donwood on their collaborative art, Wayne McGregor on his new choreographic work, a collaboration with the late Carmen Herrera, and Whistler's mother returns to Philadelphia. Ahead of an exhibition of their work in London in September, I talked to Radiohead's Thom Yorke and Stanley Donwood, who's created the artwork with Yorke for every Radiohead album since 1994, as well as the visuals accompanying Thom's solo records and side projects, including the recent records by The Smile, about their collaboration. A new work by the choreographer Wayne McGregor premieres at the Royal Opera House in London on the 9th of June, a collaboration with the Cuban-American artist Carmen Herrera, developed before Herrera's death last year at the age of 106. I talked to McGregor about the piece. And this episode's Work of the Week is Arrangement in Grey and Black, better known as Whistler's Mother by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. I talked to Jenny Thompson from the Philadelphia Museum of Art about the work. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the art newspaper by visiting our website and clicking the subscribe link at the top left of the homepage. You can choose from a digital, complete or student subscription. Do also subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening and to our sister podcast, A Brush With. And do leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, this coming September, the Tin Man Art Gallery at Cromwell Place in London will host an exhibition called The Crow Flies, featuring recent collaborative works by Thom Yorke and Stanley Donwood. It's the latest exhibition of work by the duo, whose collaborative projects date back to 1994, when Yorke invited his art college friend Donwood, whose real name is Dan Rickwood, hence you'll hear Thom refer to him as Dan throughout, to do the artwork for Radiohead's releases for the Bends album. Since then, the pair have worked together on the visuals for every Radiohead album and Yorke's side projects, from his 2006 solo album, The Eraser, to recent releases by The Smile, the band Yorke formed with Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead and Tom Skinner, the drummer from Sons of Kemet. Paintings relating to The Smile's first record, A Light for Attracting Attention, and other aspects of the project will be on view in the September show, and I spoke to Thom and Stanley about the works and nearly 30 years of collaboration. Thom and Stanley, this exhibition relates to the paintings made for the Smile album. I understand there was a bit of a shift in the way that you work in terms of the balance. Is it right that normally, Stanley, you get last dibs, as it were, and you complete the works, but whereas this time it's much more of a kind of...
Oh, no. No.
I don't know. Yeah. No, this is a bit more collaborative, sort of all the way through the painting process.
That was partly down to the fact it was the pandemic when we started doing it, and we were locked in space together, partly because we made this choice to use gouache, a paint that we'd not used before. There's loads of reasons behind it. We had a space that was a very small space that we could work in, and it just ended up being like a very sort of something that we would normally do in other ways, but we were just purely doing physically onto canvas. The process that we'd normally go through of like heckling each other. Yeah,
exactly. And there would be an idea that whatever we were making would go through various digital processes.
Normally, yeah.
Yeah, normal. Sort of like that's what's happened in the past, but in various different ways.
I'm really interested in that the fact that the shift was much more of a material one. And it relates to gouache, which is gouache dries extremely quickly.
Yeah, but it stays active. Yeah. That was so exciting. Yes. I was really into that.
So we started looking at some very old maps that were made by an Arabic pirate around sort of our medieval time.
We studied a lot of different ones, and that was one that we kept coming back to.
There was a lot of old sort of medieval paintings. There's sort of a very early one of the islands of Britain, which is very beautiful.
The green ones?
Yeah,
they're amazing.
Shows the sort of the source or the springs of rivers as sort of dots, then the river flows out to the ocean. So we were looking at these, and I was very interested in how they were made. So a lot of them were painted on vellum and with egg tempera and sometimes gold leaf. So I kind of went back to tempera, gouache and gold leaf to see what happened, and absolutely beautiful colours, because some of the pigments have been not changed since before oil paint was invented. So.
And so was that sort of luminosity that you get with gouache paints important, Tom?
I mean, yes. Honestly, it's not like whenever we'd worked before, we sat in a room together and painted and that's all we'd done. This was the first time we'd really actually just done that. We sort of removed the sort of protracted layout, cutting, editing process completely from things and just said whatever we commit to physically on this canvas is going to be the front cover, the back cover, the inside, and that's it. Which was a restriction which was exciting and quick and sort of joyful, for want of a better way of putting it. But also there was a sort of other side to it, which was just the appeal, because the context is not primarily the finished canvases. The context is to make a record cover.
Right.
And there's something very appealing about the sense that when you pick up, I mean, for example, like the first Smile record, you can see each brushstroke, you can see the
weave of the canvas
of it, which was something that was another really good reason why we wanted to go down that route, I think.
Yeah. And you like restrictions, don't you? And there's a quote that I read, I think from you, Tom, where you said you like making things as difficult as we can.
I mean...
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not deliberate. It's not like you're trying to tie yourselves in knots, but you have a starting point.
I personally find the open-ended nature of kind of digital artwork a bit problematic because you don't know when to stop. With paint, there's a limit to what you could do with it. With print, there's a limit to what you could do with it. So for the text part of the Smile project, we used some really old, I think it's like turn of the 19th to 20th century woodblock type, and it's really ugly. It's like the ugliest woodblock font I've ever seen. We were trying to make something that had typographically something of the ethos of Jamie Reed's hostage note style stuff for Sex Pistols famously,
right.
But done in a woodblock style. So it was all done on an old press, and then this was for the record then superimposed really massive in a kind of fuck off kind of way over this quite beautifully luminous tempera gouache gold leaf painting.
Talk about restrictions is like we start off with a concept and then have to, in the process of saying let's try and sort of create a topographic kind of mind map thing around, because that's what was appealing about the maps that we were looking at and so on. We really pretty much jettisoned this whole thing of the maps at all, and it just became an exploration in movement and an exploration of what the paint was doing and telling us to do and blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. Just enjoying the process, which was very much the same as making the record. It was just enjoying the process and not turning back or chasing our tail too much, just seeing where that went. I mean, you have to also remember, like, it's the same for everybody, but there was a novelty at that point in even being together, because it was the pandemic and we'd have to both test beforehand and we couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So we're locked away in the house, not doing anything else. But there was a kind of excitement in that.
So you could do that much.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and then you produce very physical work and eschewing digital material, if you like.
I was a really early adopter of the internet and digital media generally, but I kind of can't stand it now. I'm really bored of it. It's really boring. All the stuff about AI, I'm kind of bored of it. And then NFTs came along and I'm kind of,
man.
God. It's just like, fuck off and get a pencil or something.
NFTs, that really produced some excellent results.
Oh, yes. Quality
some
work.
Really worthy work came out of that.
But it's really interesting because I know that for the OK Computer cover,
that was
you were
great.
already subverting the digital, weren't you? You because you were saying we are denying the process of erasure, which is so central to that kind of digital.
I suppose,
making.
that to erase something completely is something you can. Can you do it digitally? I mean, you can, apparently, but in any other sort of drawing media, you can't. It always leaves some sort of evidence. I don't know. We've definitely deleted stuff that was really bad. But honestly, sometimes the really bad stuff is still useful.
That idea of keeping the mistakes or keeping things which aren't erased puts me in mind of oblique strategies. And through reading what you've said about your work, the oblique strategies developed by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt were these cards that you would take in need of. Yeah. It strikes me that that's a very similar thing. By setting rules, by setting restrictions, you can impose kind of structures which aid the creative process through difficulty. Or
I don't like to think of it as rules. It's more like I've kind of come to the way that I do make art. There were always restrictions in the past due to what was accessible and what you could afford or what you had access to. So, and I've kind of found that quite useful. The idea of there being a huge spectrum of all the colours in the world that you could use is quite difficult, because we did start with, we bought a lot of paint and we ended up using kind of a handful of them, really. There's not actually your palette that you use ends up, even if you've got access to everything, it ends up being quite limited, just by trial and error, really, I think.
Restriction maybe isn't quite the right word. It's more like we usually kind of like have a jumping off point and just about enough faith in ourselves to know that wherever that jumping off point isn't going to be where we think it is, and we just start and we don't really assess what we're doing.
And we don't know where we're going.
We don't know where we're going.
We don't know where we'll
Very
end up.
much like it's the same as working with other musicians, working in the band. It's the same thing where you start with very little and you just keep going until something appears that makes sense to you, or actually maybe you don't know it makes sense until later.
in terms of that balance between the collaborative nature of music and the collaborative nature of the art that you make, I'm interested by this idea of location being important, that you actually go to the studio, Stanley, and that he's there, Thom, and you're able to then chip in. Can you tell me something about?
Well, okay, yeah, got a good recent one. So Thom says we're gonna be recording in Abbey Road for a couple of weeks. I'm like, what, Abbey Road? Yeah, like where the Beatles were and everything, with the zebra crossing. Yeah, okay. So we're going to paint in Abbey Road. So one of the rooms we turn into a painting studio, and I've finally figured out how to get these ideal canvases made. So it's fine weave linen, raw linen, transparent size on it, ready to start painting, and I order a whole load of these and get them delivered to Abbey Road. And then I arrive in Abbey Road with all my painting stuff and everything, set up the room, dust sheets everywhere, it's all ready.
Floor to ceiling dust sheets.
I have to build 2 easels flat pack, put them together, which is kind of, comedy. And then there's just these huge blank canvases and
yeah.
Oh dear.
You had one sheet of A4 and I had one sheet of A4 and that's it. That's all we had. We had very little.
No idea. But
some big speakers.
We put big speakers, so there was a audio feed in from the recording studio, big screen up so I could watch what was going on as well. And we just kind of started. So the music's going on all the time. To start with, it was just paint a big blob, paint a big blue thing. And I spent ages painting, because I had this idea that I wanted to make work that was like a bad Jesus restoration. Like when they, in those churches.
One of those Spanish churches.
Exactly. I'd just been in Barcelona. And I'd been to loads of art museums, Catalan art museums, photographing this medieval stuff. So I was trying to continue the work that we'd been doing with the first Smile record, but a departure. So I was doing this really fiddly stuff. And then Thom would come in and just totally fuck it up. Like absolutely loads of paint over it. And I was just like, because I said, can you do it?
But
so
are you literally standing there?
Up.
Are you literally standing there with paintbrush in hand when Thom comes along with his own paintbrush in hand and stands in front of you and makes these marks?
Alongside, they're quite big canvases.
It's civilised.
So we could both sort. But so he completely, it's like he's introducing the dereliction of several hundred years onto this painting.
I'm the weather.
He's the weather. And then I'm the bad Jesus restorer. So I come in and repaint what you can see, not quite as well as I had before. So the idea was that I wanted to make artwork that looked like it had existed for a long time. So there was a limit to how far you can take that in the
A
time
short
that
amount of
we had,
time.
2 weeks. So, in fact, that was back in middle of March, and now we're, beginning of June, and we've made 10 pictures.
I think it became something else very, very
It
quickly,
did
as
become
usual.
something else.
We both have the knack of having a kind of pitch, or whatever you might want to call it, but really when it comes down to it, we just sort of basically get lost in what we're doing, and at some point one of us taps us or the other on the shoulder and said, that one's done now.
Right,
You know,
yeah.
that's always sort of been the case, actually,
Yeah.
even when we're sitting in
Yeah.
front of laptops using Photoshop, processing
Yeah.
layers and layers of random things. It's still the same process. We both benefit from the other knowing when to stop or when to steer it another way, or when to, whatever medium it is.
And that blank canvas that you were just talking about, having a bare space sitting in front of you, is that always daunting, or is there ever like a relish to get on with?
No, it's always daunting.
No,
it's exactly the
it's
same as
always
music.
daunting.
It's always daunting. But then with music, there's always something you can reach for. There's always some place you can start. There's always an idea that you haven't tried yet. There's always somewhere to go. So I think actually painting is different only in the sense that, yes, there is that moment at the beginning where you're like, you really are terrified of your mistakes.
So it's good to start with one. It's good to start with an accident. So, if you just get something on there, I think sometimes I felt almost like I'm just sort of throwing paint at a camp to stop it being this vacuum, just to make a sound in it, so you've got something that...
But we're not abstract either. That's what we're doing isn't expressionism. It's not any of that. I find it really weird. I think it's always kind of been the same. Like, we either obsess about objects or icons or figures or landscapes, but things just keep coming back and repeating. And I think, or probably I do the same with lyrics as well, where patterns emerge, or you're still talking about that, or keys or instruments, or it's not devoid of any context at all.
It strikes me, though, that even though it is not devoid of context and it is not abstract, you don't illustrate the music.
No, yeah, I think we've sort of almost reflexively kind of returned to the idea of narrative and landscape, and it's like I'm trying to always fight against it, but it keeps coming back. There's a limit to how long and how hard you can fight against it.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was art as a kind of liberation, because I know, Tom, that after OK Computer, you said that you turned to art as a means of escaping. I don't know if it was quite writer's block or musician's block, or...
It was a terrifying self-consciousness about, like, if you do enough interviews, you start believing the constructed nonsense that you put on top of the stuff that you didn't construct.
Right.
So you start to second guess too much. And that had sort of paralyzed me in terms of, like, every time I picked up an instrument, or that's how it felt anyway, there'd be these voices going, oh shit, that's rubbish, you can't do that, oh, you've already done that, or what you said, like literally analysis to the point where it was deafening. So choosing to work just walking and landscape and something simple where it was creative, it was a response to something, but it wasn't involving any kind of analysis. It was sort of like a physical act, really. It was a physical response to being and also kind of the shock of, this was down in Cornwall and on the moors, the shock of that desolation and how exciting that was, and how, having gone through such a mad period of travel and people being in my face, just to be absolutely nowhere in the middle of an ancient landscape. It was all those things together was a way of releasing this mad analysis that was going on in my head. I've never had it that bad since, thank God. It did teach me that I enjoy the creative process in sort of lots of different ways. I enjoy writing, I enjoy music, I enjoy art, I enjoy just collaborating with people. So I don't see much of a war between any of it, really. Right. And I feel myself very fortunate that I'm able to move between all those different things.
I get the sense from the way that you're talking it, for both of you, this collaboration is a sort of means of guarding against preciousness of one form or another, a kind of means of circumventing any level of complacency. You're testing each other, you're stopping each other doing the obvious thing in a way.
Yeah, I kind of broadly agree, I think. if I've understood you right.
We offer two different ways of thinking about things a lot of the time.
If left to myself, I kind of have a tendency towards a kind of neurotic, obsessive detailing, or I don't know what it is, but it's very Virgo, I think. My girlfriend, she's always, for years, is just saying, just let go a bit, can't you? And so it's kind of like that's my right hand is like, and my left hand wants to go a bit mental. But I mean, working with Thom, it's kind of,
I have no right hand.
He's just all left hand.
So
I'm all right hand, and it's kind of like when you put the two together are better than either on their own, I think.
And is it right that you even complete different tasks within the same picture? So you're good at mountains, you're good at oceans, or
absolutely. You just that's it.
With these particular things, it's kind of funny. I mean, it's kind of funny.
Can you put some hills on that? Yeah.
Like clearly you're not very good at that. I'll do it.
Yeah. I think we've got a bit better at having a modicum of confidence in the fact that we might be able to draw and we might be able to paint, because to start with we totally just used photographic and found imagery, even to the extent we didn't even use our own photographs. We photographed TV screens and things like that, so everything was found. It was almost like you couldn't be blamed for anything.
That was exactly what it was about.
Yeah. So all of OK Computer, there was no drawing in that, I don't think, apart from the sort of scribbling out of. So it was all found stuff. It was all imagery from somewhere else. Even just our own photographs sometimes, and then they're scribbled out. But then there's a sort of limit to what you can express with that. So we kind of like left that behind a little bit with the next project, and they've got some massive canvases, like really big, and then just painting with your whole arm, with the whole sleeve of your jumper and stuff like that. We're actually using your whole energy that you have. Rather than just your brain
and endless biro drawing.
This is the kid amnesia, which is it's gone down almost in folklore as like the idiom of a difficult period for a band.
It was difficult only in the sense that we were really intimidated about where we'd been thrown. I think that offered a certain kind of paralysis initially, and then once a long period had gone by. I mean, we were at it on and off pretty much for a whole year without stopping. When we started to look back at what we were doing in the course of that year, both on tape and with the art and everything, it was kind of like, oh, actually, this is really exciting. The crisis pushed us to overcompensate by just working pathologically without stopping.
Yeah, because Radiohead had become very well known after OK Computer. And I think I kind of deliberately tried to ignore that, not to kind of take any notice of that, because it would have not been helpful to kind of all of what you're saying about too many interviews or something like that. I don't think it's very useful, that sort of thing. If you're trying to make some work, it doesn't help.
In other words, you didn't buy into the media myth of what Radiohead was. You had to listen to what the band were doing in the studio.
Exactly, yeah. Trying to consciously avoid the media, because it's present company accepted a load of bollocks, isn't it?
But also, it seems to me that it was really important that, and I don't know how actively this was happening, but both the music, your lyrics, and the images that you were producing were clearly being massively informed by the news. So the media in the sense of global events, geopolitics, and so on.
Maybe.
No, I go along with the...
Maybe, yeah. There was odd things that would seep in, but it's always been like that.
Yeah.
I mean, we were working in a house, if we're talking about that period, for example, we were working in a house where there were bombers flying over to Bosnia every night from Bryce Norton. That was weird.
So you didn't need the news, actually.
No.
Going overhead. Then the Eraser was a response to being in a very, very bad flood which destroyed loads of houses.
So there was the news, but it was also real.
Each period has got these kind of things. I mean, honestly, I think that the Smile, the first record, A Light for Attracting Attention, was very much just our response to being in the pandemic. It was like we didn't get to spend much time with each other, both recording and in terms of art. And when we did, we went nuts.
Yeah.
And we just did whatever we had because
really
that's
fast.
what we had.
Working really fast.
So I think it depends. Sometimes we deliberately adopt little bits and pieces, but I think always the objective is to unload what could look like loaded imagery. Right? It's the same with the lyrics. I do the same with the lyrics, where a lot of the time things that sound very emotional or whatever could just be cut and pasted from something I hear or randomly, walk into, or blah, 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 or something on the TV, something on the radio, blah, blah. But I take it out of context. It's just one line. This stuff is important to me, and this stuff I feel we all share, but Dan and I especially had a lot of that kind of thing through art school. Like, was this idea of taking language and images and pulling them out of where they came from and saying something different with them, or just allowing them to exist out of context. And see what happens,
It was a very interesting time to go to art college at the end of the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, Thatcher quits. I remember we had a Thatcher quits party.
Right.
That was quite good. But yeah, so there was definitely a lot going on, and I think we'd come out of a time in the 1980s when a lot the idea that art should be informed with politics. And it was, it was a time when the left was definitely in opposition, as it is now.
Yeah.
And art seemed to be the only
and music
place. Art and music.
I was actually talking to my daughter about this because she's been studying British politics and British history, and talking. She was asking about punk and post-punk and the response to Thatcher, and I'm like, well, that really was the most overt period of left-wing, well, not necessarily left-wing culture, but culture reacting to what directly to politics. When we became famous, there was a lot of, to me, the opposite of that, where politics and culture
coincided with
very much like what happened to me, sort of like a poxy little mini version of what happened in America post-war, with the adoption of a lot of the abstract artists and so on. It's like, we need our own culture. We'll have you lot.
Yeah.
It was
and they
sort
were
of
co-opted into.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was a lot of that with the Brit pop and the art stuff, the Saatchi Gallery and all that stuff. But it was all like serving a purpose in a way that I find very unpleasant.
And the art then was in the early mid-90s was, as far as I could tell, was resolutely non-political. It was kind of interesting, some of it, but it was very decorative for the times. Things can only get better. And
it was nice to be working.
Things were good,
it was nice to be working exclusively, making. I guess we didn't really maybe consider it art. We were hiding behind the fact that it was always record covers, so we didn't have to think of it like that. But at the same time, we were very much approaching it like this is an opportunity to be creative in however different as we possibly could, and to be not exactly provocative, but like humorous, stupid, sarcastic, nasty, whatever.
And political as well, because it was. I can kind of remember walking through London, pushing my daughter in a pushchair, and Labour had just got in, and it felt absolutely brilliant. I'd never seen such a happy
3 months
city
later
in my life. It was amazing, and then fairly rapidly, of course, things unravelled and ended rather sadly for a lot of people. But the art that was known about, that was very visible at the time, was, as I say, it was like not political. It was, you know what it was. But we had this kind of somewhere that wasn't quite art, and it wasn't quite advertising. But it was. I mean, we're advertising music, we're advertising product. But we had billboards.
Yeah, but that was what was exciting. Was in some ways, we didn't need galleries. We had a record company that was paying for us and saying to us, "Can you make us some more work so that we can do a series of adverts in magazines?
We need a 48 sheet for this location,
this." Constantly asking for us to create stuff, and it was a bit like, well, okay, it was like a better place, a better context to be in at the time. We felt, not that we didn't want to be any part of that whole thing at all anyway. But
it was interesting that I know you said, Tom, that the first time that you became really conscious that you were going to have to be working on record covers with kind of graphic designers, you had an immediate reaction, which is like, this is not going to happen. I can't work in this kind of product-y way. So what you're saying is that you're using the kind of, if you like, the platforms that are normally provided to very commercial activities to subvert that whole process effectively through.
It wasn't as conceptual as that. It was like wanting to be cool and wanting to adopt as much of a DIY aspect to it as it possibly could, because the artists I admired were doing the same. Like Michael Stipe was very heavily involved in the cover work for REM's records, even though he was mostly using photography. You know, David Bowie is very involved in the design of the sleeve artworks and so on. It's like, you know, a lot of artists I admire, musicians, were also heavily involved in the art, and I could not, in all consciousness, let that go. It didn't feel right, and sort of doing a sort of shopping of other people's work and just saying, oh, I'll use your work for this, also felt deeply wrong. It's like, if it hasn't got some of me in it, I can't be a part of it, sort of thing. And that's why I called Dan, because like there's no way I can do this on my own, because I'm not confident enough, and I don't. He did
literally call me. We had like one phone in this shared house I lived in, and he phoned up and said, do you want to have a go at doing a record cover? I'm like, I don't know how to do a record cover, but I'll have a go.
And this was the Bend?
This was,
I guess, it was.
Or the My Iron Lung EP.
Yeah,
was
that's right,
project.
It was all the same thing,
Yeah.
And then your hair fell out.
Then my hair fell out. Oh, that hadn't fallen out just before.
No, it was doing it while it was...
I think my eyebrows fell out while that,
Stanley and Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Grand. Bye-bye.
The Crow Flies will be at Tin Man Art at Cromwell Place in London in September. Exact dates are to be confirmed. Visit tinmanart.com to find out more. Coming up, Wayne McGregor on his collaboration with Carmen Herrera, and Whistler's mother returns to Philadelphia. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities has retracted a Dutch museum's licence for an archaeological dig for displaying images of Beyoncé, Rihanna, Eddie Murphy and the rapper Nas imitating ancient Egyptian queens and pharaohs. The exhibition, called Kemet, Egypt in Hip Hop, Jazz, Soul and Funk, runs at the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden until September and explores ancient Egypt's influence on modern black musicians. Wim Weiland, the managing director of the museum, called out what he called anti-black sentiment after the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities wrote to his museum 2 weeks ago, accusing it of falsifying history and Afrocentrism. The dig in Saqqara has been ongoing for almost half a century, Weiland said, and while he accepted the Egyptian authorities' right to stop it, he said that doing so with an accusation of misrepresenting history was rubbing salt in the wound. A large chunk of oak, preserved and stained black by its millennia in a layer of peat in Berkshire in southern England, has been revealed as the oldest piece of carved wood in Britain. It dates to more than 6,000 years ago, making it 2,000 years older than Stonehenge. The metre-long piece of timber, with carvings that have been compared to designs on ancient pottery, was found on a building site in the village of Boxford. It's now been dated by experts from historic England, with scientists from Nottingham in the UK and Groningen in the Netherlands, to between 4,640 and 4,605 BCE, making it 500 years older than the only other known example of late Mesolithic decoratively carved wood found in Wales. Françoise Gillot, an artist whose output spanned more than 80 years and defied simple categorization and efforts to define her merely as a footnote in the story of her former lover Pablo Picasso, died on Tuesday in New York. She was 101. Her daughter, Aurélia Engel, said Gillot had recently suffered from lung and heart problems. Gillot was born in the Paris suburb of Neuilly-sur-Seine in 1921 and had her first exhibition in the French capital in 1943. She then met Picasso, with whom she had a 10-year relationship, described in the 1964 memoir written with the journalist Carlton Lake called Life with Picasso. It attracted the ire of Picasso's supporters and eventually made her a heroic figure in feminist art history. But her primary vocation was as an artist. She's featured in countless exhibitions since her relationship with Picasso ended in the mid-1950s. You can read all these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS or Android. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Christie's New York presents the second instalment of the Anne and Gordon Getty collection, Temple of Wings, until the 15th of June. The three-part auction series features fine and decorative arts from the Gettys' landmark home in Berkeley Hills. Highlights include works by Charles Robert Ashby, William Morris, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and others. Proceeds benefit select arts and science organisations designated by Anne and Gordon Getty. Find out more at christies.com/Getty. Welcome back. Now, this week, the Royal Opera House in London premieres a new choreographic work for the Royal Ballet by Wayne McGregor, the company's resident choreographer. Called Untitled, it's inspired by the works of the Cuban-American artist Carmen Herrera, who died in 2022, aged 106, after working closely with McGregor on the set for the work. A third collaborator on the project is the Icelandic composer Anna Thorvaldsdottir, and costumes are designed by Burberry's chief creative officer Daniel Lee, with lighting design by Lucy Carter. I went to the Opera House to talk to Wayne McGregor about Herrera and this extraordinary new work. Wayne, when did you first meet Carmen Herrera?
I met her in 2019. Nicholas Logsdale was an amazing galleryist, introduced me to her, and I went to New York to see her in her studio, which was kind of incredible. She was 102 at that point and still in incredible kind of like physical shape and really working a lot, still working, and really excited to potentially be doing this new work for the stage, which was her first and only work for the stage, as it turned out.
And her work really only emerged into a wider public consciousness in the last sort of decade or two before her death, actually, didn't it? And were you sort of one of the people like me who were just like, where has this person come from? You know, because she's been making all this work for all these years and only now we're hearing about it. And it was an extraordinary revelation, it seemed to me.
Totally. And this incredible kind of like commitment to work over all of that period. So, you know, continuing to work and not necessarily show, continue to innovate and refine her visual language and her visual palette, to completely be continuing to experiment in this amazing space that she had lived in since I think the 60s, but pretty much had been ignored. And it was such a revelation to see the work and then actually the range of the work, you know, the kind of the commitment to range and the commitment to really finding new forms of expression in a very kind of like beautifully refined grammar and syntax.
Yeah, she spoke about a lifelong process of purification. And it seems to me that must be really fertile territory for dance.
It is. I mean, the essential is really important. And, you know, one of the things we're trying to do all the time with bodies is find kind of like true expression with as limited ornamentation as we can. And actually, one of the things even about classical ballet is it's working towards a kind of a purity of execution, a purity of line, to allow you then to channel expression and channel a directness. And, you know, one of the things I've been very interested in my career is taking that kind of very formal language but then subverting it and using it maybe more asymmetrically, or taking that line for a walk in a kind of a different direction. And I think one of the amazing things about Carmen's work is that she balances this kind of like formalism with a really interesting sense of the precarious, you know, or the liminal, you know, that there's a sense in which you can look at the work and go, oh, that's just a green triangle on a white page. Or you can go, actually, just look where she's balanced that point, that tip, where it vanishes off into space. Just look at the pressure that she creates on a page where the line sits in a really unusual place, precariously balanced against another form. And it opens up, for me, all of these opportunities and spaces of perception where you can actually then start to feel something inside. So meaning emerges from it. Right. And I love that. I love that the kind of the primers, these like kind of like really essential primers, start to unlock meaning or unfold meaning in a really extraordinary way. And that's why I love the painting and the work so much.
Tell us about the kind of balance of austerity and fullness in the work, if you like. There's a really nice quote from Carmen about the black and white and the green and white works, which is it's about yes and no. And it seems to me there's a lot of yes and no in your production, in these movements. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I try to do that. I mean, I try to be as austere and kind of rigorous with the physical palette as Carmen had been with the work itself, you know. And, you know, one of the things about the work that Carmen made for the stage is that she's working on a huge canvas at a scale that she's not worked on before. You know, we sent her a little scale model of the Opera House, and my second visit was her showing me the designs in the scale model, which was really extraordinary, and moving objects around. And actually, we had several options. Actually, you can see the model here. It's just right next really nice. To me. Yeah. But actually, you'll see that green form we ended up not using, partly because of this thing about how much information can a space hold, which is already quite rich with detail. We took the green structure out in a way to provide us with a little bit more openness to be able to read. So the essential, I think, is really important. But I think what she does in her work anyway is just direct attention. And I think what you're doing on a stage or on a canvas is trying to direct attention. And sometimes that attention is visual attention. So how is it that you can actually watch and read the image visually? But also because we're working in a live form, which is also involving music, we're thinking about acoustic attention. And I think when you see Carmen's work, you have like a kind of a rhythmic sense of what's happening. You almost like hear the work, you don't just see it. There's a sense in which you can get a sense with where she places colour in relationship to line, what the sound of that image is. And all of that allows you to feel the work in a different way. And I think that's what we were trying to get at the stage space. It is minimal, one might say, but at the same time, it really interrelates in a really extraordinary way with Anna's music, which in itself shares some of the properties of Carmen's work, but also offers all these extraordinary openings for possibility.
Tell us more about Anna Thorvaldsdottir's music, because it really is quite something in the sense that there might have been a more automatic reflex to go for something which aligned perhaps more directly with the history of minimalism in music. But Anna's work is emphatically not like Steve Reich, for instance.
No.
It takes the work in a very different direction, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And I think that's one of the joys about putting artists together in making new work. You know, I guess one of my jobs as a choreographer is not just to make the movement, but actually to curate what the experience is. And that's partly how is it that you find really extraordinary people to work together. And I wanted to start with Carmen. I wanted Carmen pretty much to do what she wanted and for us to respond in a way which would create meaning from those spaces. But when I look at Carmen's paintings, I don't think about Steve Reich or a sense of serialism or Philip Glass. You know, what I actually think about is much more epic vistas. And Anna's work is really extraordinary because she takes kind of a sonic will which is unrecognizable in the orchestra often. The orchestra, it's a very different way of playing instruments, it's a very different way of experiencing sound. And what she does, she sets up a kind of a sonic proposition, a sonic idea, and then new ideas unfold from that, but from a very minimal, very rigorous palette. And it demands your attention in a very particular way. It demands you have to engage in a particular way. But for me, it's really moving. So, you know, it's not just texture moving. And the more that you listen and the more that you shift your attention around her acoustic spaces, the more is revealed about the nature of that music. And those two things are really analogous, you know, with Carmen, you know, so they felt like ideal kind of companions. And, you know, the other thing about Anna's music that I really love is the shift in color and sometimes the relief of a little bit of melody you can catch onto, but it's transient. These musical spaces you can't quite catch hold of. And I find that about Carmen's work as well, that you can't say it is X, you know, it's not concrete in that way. What it demands is that you allow that today I'm experiencing it like this and tomorrow I'm experiencing it in a different way. And I think Anna's music does that. I think, you know, from our first rehearsal yesterday, we had our first rehearsal with orchestra and stage yesterday. And it was really an amazing kind of like fragile magic, you know, from things that you felt were quite concrete and very, very specific to things that were almost like demattering or dematerializing in front of you. And I think that's what we were really aiming for. How is it you can get a body, which is a very structured thing? We all have bodies. We all experience bodies one to another. We understand what a body does and is. How can you actually blur that body into something else so it becomes partly environmental and it becomes partly just acoustic in itself, and you start to watch the rhythm of the body rather than the shape of the body? And these are like little plays that we were trying to work on all together.
One of the things I was struck by, because I was lucky enough to be at that rehearsal, was these subtle correspondences between all three of the different elements, where at one point you would actually see a dancer move absolutely rhythmically with Anna's music, or they would align with the sets, and also the fantastic costumes which form all kinds of new geometries and abstractions right the way through the work. To what extent was that a very careful and kind of really structured process, or to what extent do you build it in as a kind of improvisatory move? Yeah,
it's not at all improvisatory, so it's all completely structured. And I think that comes from the fact that we wanted to create this idea of slippage, but that slippage had to really align at the right time, you know, and obviously when, you know, 80 live musicians are playing live music, it's not exactly the same time. So we needed more than just anchors in the music. You know, Anna's music is very, very structured and very ordered. You know, it might sound sometimes as if it is improvised. And I love that about watching dance that feels as though it's improvised, but actually the rigor in that compositional process is absolute. And I guess what we tried to do with the dancers, rather than listening to the music and dancing to it, was actually how can we time a somatic response which would be 56 seconds, so that they could feel what 56 seconds was. Or we could feel when there's this surge in the music that you have this kind of arc to be able to move through. So in a way, they have to kind of picture time rather than count time, which is a big challenge and a really beautiful experiment. But I think they've done it really well. They've really embodied this fantastic ability to use their instrument in that way and to dance differently, to make real-time decisions. And we try to do that also with Lucy Carter, who's the lighting designer that I've worked with for 30 years. How is it that you work with a space like that? So you almost make mini choreographic kind of kinetic lighting installations that also have shift and change and order and structure, which allow you to sometimes see the Carmen work in relief in shadow, that actually sometimes it allows you to create more mystery or slightly changes the tone of it. So, one of the things we try to do is take this green triangle and put it into a negative space and look black by the end. So it looks like a kind of a tunnel that could be endless, And all of these connect up with what the body is doing. So how is it that you create more negative space between the forms of the body on stage? So it's one of the most empty in terms of bodies on stage piece that I've ever made. It is very like elemental, it's only solos, duets. There's one kind of flooding on the stage at a certain point, but the rest is very empty. And then I guess the other thing I'd say about Daniel's costumes, this is Daniel Lee from Burberry. He created these extraordinary abstractions on the body where you read proportion in a totally different way. What that allows you to do is see the body sometimes as pure sculpture. They become sculptural forms, and other times they become emotional forms. But the geometries that kind of like coalesce and connect and obscure one another are super interesting. And they remind us, and something we want to do of Carmen's E Structuras, which are these kind of like architectural works which have spaces in between, again, often very strangely or precariously balanced that you can see through. So there's a sense of solidity and there's a sense of transparency or an opening to another world. And I think Daniel's costumes really help us create that with the bodies on stage.
Yeah, I'm really aware, looking at the model that you were talking about earlier on, you took that green form out, but actually you've done it with the bodies, right?
Exactly, and that's why. And so when all of the costumes came and we saw everything on stage, it felt like just one too many elements. And we thought it was better to kind of reduce down and make the body just operate like that rather than just try and repeat. And I'm sure if Carmen was here that she would have done that first.
Right, that's interesting. I want to talk about abstraction because, of course, the minute you flood a stage with bodies or even occupy the stage with one body, it's figurative because the body is a figurative thing. So how do you reconcile abstraction and the body? Are you attempting to create abstractions with the body?
I think you can't create abstractions with the body because the job of the brain is to create meaning from things. And as human beings, when we see other humans, we can't help but read story or read relationship or read emotion. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're searching for. That's how we organize our world, right? But I think one thing that we can do is push the body into a kind of physicality which isn't normalized action. Right. So for me, normalized action is also a balletic vocabulary that you recognize. So that might be pirouettes or, tendus, things that you recognize, or it could be a hip hop vocabulary, any physical vocabulary that you know. One of the challenges or exciting things to do is to push that body so it's beyond that, so that your kinesthetic sense while watching, your sense of where it sits in your own body, is altered or changed. You don't know how that feels, right? Because you've probably never done it. So it's a form of virtuosity in a way, but that allows you to do things with bodies. And certainly when bodies are in correlation or relationship with another body, where you can create kind of like architectural compositions with bodies, where bodies always then have a degree of freedom that you couldn't do on your own. This creates a sense of distance in some way, allows you to watch the body perhaps more abstractly. So you can never really do that emotionally, but I think there's something in the way in which if you work with language which is pushed further forward in a direction that's not recognized in your own body, it creates a somatic sense which is unfamiliar. And that unfamiliar allows you, I think, to open up other channels of experience which are exciting and sometimes challenging, sometimes confronting.
Right. And you called this work Untitled, which is very knowing, I think, and I enjoy the knowingness, if you like. So, of course, it's a reference to Carmen's Untitled works, but it's also about that austerity, that severity within the work as well. It's about saying to the audience, please make meaning, right?
Yeah. And also that's very unusual in dance because, if you think about the history of dance, it's, first of all, you've got history of dance, which is very narratively based and narratively in a very particular form, where you're saying, this is the story and this is what you have to read. Are you reading it? And that's one of the nervousnesses for people about watching dance, that they always feel that they're missing something. Then you had all those kind of amazing postmodern, particularly American artists who were working in a different way, going, well, watch dance or experience dance in a different way. Recently, I've been making a lot of work which has concrete meanings, or multiple meanings. So we've been working on story ballets, work which might be based on Virginia Woolf or Dante. I've just worked with Margaret Atwood in Canada on the Mad Adam trilogy. But these are very clear kind of like narrative anchors. And I wanted just to offer the audience an opportunity to go, let's not tell you anything about this work at all, apart from the artists that are working on it. I would love you to come completely fresh to a piece that hopefully you'll just experience in real time, but that you will give it attention, that you will, spend a little bit of time with it. Another one of my great favourite artists is Agnes Martin. And I realised in my experience of looking at Agnes Martin or feeling Agnes Martin, that it's so easy to dismiss it as, just lines on a page or something. And it's only through repeat viewing and asking questions of it and entering into a dialogue with it that you start to get the magic and the richness and the transcendence of that work. And that's the same for Carmen. And hopefully it's going to be the same with this piece, that it's the repeat viewing and the seeking on behalf of the audience that's going to help us construct the meaning of it. That doesn't mean there's no meaning there. It means it's there to be revealed when you're in an open enough state to be able to process stuff.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you about, there were great works, particularly I'm thinking of Merce Cunningham, where he corresponded directly with minimalists like, for instance, Robert Morris and also Frank Stella, for instance.
Yeah.
Do you have to shut those off from your mind, or can you refer back to them? Is there a kind of art historical process or dance historical process which happens through making works like this with Carmen?
Yeah, I think there has to be. I always find it incredible that young choreographers have never seen any work of Merce, for example. They're working within sometimes a vacuum, which is bewildering to me because it might not be ballet, but actually that way of responding or working with other art forms in collaboration is really extraordinary. Merce is a big hero of mine, so unfortunately I can't ever shake him off my shoulder. And actually, in a way, I was watching the other day and I was hoping if Merce had seen this work particularly, that actually he would really enjoy it, because it also comes from him. It comes from his bravery in divorcing a way of watching dance which was always led by a very kind of like analog relationship with music. When I'm thinking about Merce, I'm thinking about his bravery in allowing the artists that he works with to really contribute within their own terms and not at the service of the thing that you think they should be making.
They're not just doing sets.
They're not just doing sets. They're provocations, and part of the job of the experience of those artists working together is to find out, what are those potential correlations or interests in spaces between those objects and musical forms on stage, and allowing a freedom and a breadth of opportunity for those artists to really sit sometimes at the primary moment in experiencing the work. So it's not always the dance bit that is the most important, that actually all of these come in and out of focus at different times. And that's extraordinary. That's it. And I think Mercer's taught us how to watch in that way. And so I wouldn't ever want him to shake him off my shoulder.
Wayne, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Untitled is at the Royal Opera House in London until the 17th of June as part of the triple bill with Corybantic Games, a tribute to Leonard Bernstein by the Royal Ballet's artistic associate Christopher Wheeldon, and a revival of Anastasia Act 3 by Wayne McGregor's late predecessor as artistic director of the Royal Ballet, Kenneth Macmillan. And finally, it's time for the work of the week. Few paintings ever created are better known than Arrangement in Graham Black, better known as Whistler's Mother by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. It's travelled from its home at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, it's been part of the French National Collection since 1891, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the first time it's returned to Pennsylvania since it was shown there in 1881. It's part of an exhibition called The Artist's Mother, Whistler and Philadelphia, curated by Jenny Thompson, and I spoke to Jenny about the the work and the show. Jenny, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous paintings in the world, but I'd like to go back to the very making of the painting, because is it right, in a way, Whistler only really painted his mother by accident?
That's absolutely correct. He had another model who was scheduled to come to him, but she fell ill, and so he decided that he would paint his mother, who was living with him in London at the time. The sittings went incredibly well, surprisingly so for Whistler, who ordinarily would sometimes take 1.5 to 2 years to complete a portrait. But for his mother, the whole painting was done in about 3 months. He obviously had her nearby. She would sit for him every single day, except for Sundays. She would not. She didn't feel that was appropriate to sit on Sundays.
Right, and the relationship between them is worth talking about, because she was effectively his sort of manager, his studio assistant and so on. She did so much for him, right?
She absolutely helped him with scheduling models. She would give them tea. She would feed them lunch if they were there. On one occasion, we know that she actually went to get paints to assist him. She would also keep his clients happy, particularly when they were encountering delays with finishing his work. So she was a great assistance to him. I think he also just relied on her running the household and keeping things moving smoothly.
Right. And did she turn a blind eye to, or just not know about, his wilder activities?
I think it was a little bit of both. I suspect she knew that he was probably up to other more bohemian activities. I think she certainly turned a blind eye to Joe Heffernan and any of the women that he had relationships with. But I suspect she was also a very pious woman who thought the best of her son and was going to pretend not to see other sides of his life.
Okay, so it was first exhibited in the Royal Academy in London. Is it right it almost didn't make it? It was almost rejected?
That's exactly right. The jury was looking at it. They weren't certain that it should go in. And it was only when another artist, William Buxell, said, well, if you don't accept this, I'm going to resign from the Academy, that it really sort of forced them to take it on.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Is one of the reasons that it was problematic for that jury because of this insistence of Whistler to call it Arrangement in Grey and Black rather than saying this is a portrait of my mother?
That's exactly right. So the title, Arrangement in Grey and Black, was so sort of problematic for so many audiences and so many individuals initially. He does include his mother as the subtitle. So for all of his, claims later on that, to me it's interesting as a portrait of my mother, but why does the public care about who the subject of the painting is?
Right. Yeah, I love that story. So he uses it to describe English folks' reaction to it, doesn't he? But actually, it seems to have been the pattern for audiences whenever they encountered this picture, that they just simply weren't going to accept Whistler's terms for viewing this work.
Exactly. Now, they felt the subject was more important than the way perhaps it had been painted. And that, of course, caused Whistler some sort of anxiety because he wanted it to be about the artistry, not about the subject.
Right, so let's look at the composition then. Tell us about this Arrangement of Grey and Black. What are we looking at?
So we're looking at an older woman seated. We see her in a really strict profile. So she's looking off to the left. There's a wonderful dappled silk cloth, thought perhaps to be a kimono, that's hanging on the wall, somewhat in front of her. She is dressed in black, which, of course, is what Whistler's mother wore from 1849 when she became a widow onward. And we see on the wall 2 frames. The one just behind her head is, we can't see the subject of that print, but we do see a print in front of her, which has been identified and we now recognize as one of Whistler's prints of London, as seen from the Thames. So it's almost like he's bringing himself into the portrait as well.
And rather wonderfully, you've got that alongside the portrait of his mother, right?
Exactly. So we are using one of the copies of Black Lion Wharf that's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection, which is right next to the painting, which then helps to sort of draw out some of the details that we see in Whistler's work, because that's one of, I think, the surprising aspects of encountering Whistler's mother in person, which is that details which in reproduction seem so crisp, when you encounter them on the surface, you realize how thinly worked aspects of the painting are and how he's almost rubbed the pigment pigment into the canvas. And that the print is one of those places where that comes out.
Absolutely. And that his technique really is remarkable, isn't it, actually? And this evenness in certain places and then just sudden jumps where there's a detail which you see all over the place in the nocturne paintings and so on. But you can see how, to a certain extent, he is abstracting what he's seeing in this work.
Exactly. And I think that comes out when you start to look at details like the chair legs, which are just barely roughed in. But then he does come back and he uses a great deal of brushwork, even bravura brushwork, in depicting her face and a little bit of the lace around her cuffs. And then that kimono, the silk, has just wonderful dabs of paint with yellow and white in there. And of course, you've got the pink on her cheeks. So he uses thicker paint and more colorful paint in very specific and directed ways across the canvas.
Now, the reason you're doing the show is because it was shown in Philadelphia in 1881. Tell us about that showing. How much of a kind of sensation was the painting at the time?
Well, that's been one of the puzzling things for me. I've gone through all kinds of Philadelphia papers looking for conversation about Whistler, and particularly about Whistler's mother. And there isn't a tremendous amount. So it's sort of startling. Philadelphia audiences had heard a great deal about Whistler in the paper, but they hadn't had an opportunity to see his work until Whistler's mother was shown at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1881. And in fact, Americans in general had only had their first opportunity to see his work in 1876 in Baltimore. So they knew of him by reputation, but hadn't had an opportunity to see his work in person. They paid a great deal more attention in the papers to the work of Thomas Eakins, who was a local artist. And it was only the art periodicals, particularly the perhaps New York-based art periodicals, that started to pay more attention to the work. And they commented, as had London papers almost a decade earlier, that the title was a snub, a sort of slight to the woman who posed for it and said, you need to overlook that snub and just enjoy the painting for its subject, not for its title.
That's so fascinating. Curiously, his mother had died earlier in 1881. So do we have any record of Whistler's own feelings about this work being shown in his homeland in the year that she died? Is there any significance to the fact that it was in America at that time?
I think the reason he sent it to the U.S., I suspect, was entirely because his mother had passed away earlier that year. She had hoped that the painting, she was very proud of the painting. She was very pleased with the outcome of it, and I think she felt very invested in it and collaborated with him on it.
Is it right she called it my painting?
Yes, she did, absolutely. She had hoped that the portrait would be shown in Philadelphia in 1876 as part of the Centennial Exposition, so a great World's Fair held in Philadelphia, and it wasn't available at that time. So I think Whistler regretted that he hadn't allowed it to be seen in the U.S. during his mother's lifetime. And so when he was approached by Anna Lee Merritt, who is a Philadelphia painter who was living abroad but was working on behalf of the Pennsylvania Academy to organize an exhibition of American artists who were living abroad, I think he proposed. She never actually asked for Whistler's mother, but he proposed that he would send the portrait to Philadelphia.
Right, and it was only much later, in fact, wasn't it, that it became a kind of American icon. It's become this icon across the world, of course, but it was a much later tour of the States in which suddenly it started gaining a significance, which has led to all sorts of things, including statues and a direct association with motherhood.
Exactly. So I think once the painting is acquired by the French government in 1891, it begins to grow in popularity. But it's really this remarkable 2-year tour that it makes in the U.S. From 1932 to 34, which makes it become this extraordinary icon.
And there's this wonderful thing that Alfred Barr, the founder of the Museum of Modern Art, does, which is make a kind of diagram of this painting, as Whistler would have loved, I'm sure, as a kind of abstraction, so that it really does enter the sort of canon of the kind of American perceptions of modern art at that time too, right?
Right, absolutely. No, when Barr makes a diagram of the painting, he's sort of bringing it back to its formal qualities, which, of course, Whistler would have appreciated so much. Of course, when he borrowed the painting, I think he suspected that it would become very popular. He was under quite a deal of pressure to make the Museum of Modern Art sustainable and to build an endowment for the museum. And so it was a kind of almost a desperate measure to borrow Whistler's mother along with Grant Wood's American Gothic and to create a kind of trajectory of American art that would bring it really up to the contemporary moment. And I think it surpassed even his wildest expectations for the popularity of the painting. And then it became a kind of wonderful, very inspiring moment for Americans as it toured the country in the midst of the Great Depression. And it sort of seemed that apparently Americans needed their mother at that moment. And she becomes a kind of universal mother as she travels across, all the way to the West Coast and then back to New York.
Now, in your exhibition, you're showing it alongside other depictions of mothers, and we don't have time to go into all of them here, but I thought it would be really nice actually to focus on one of them, which is this extraordinary painting by Henry Ursawa Tanner, who's an African-American artist. But tell us more about that, because it's an extraordinary story as well as a great work.
So Tanner is one of the artists who had seen Whistler's mother when it was shown in Philadelphia in 1881. He doesn't respond immediately to it. In fact, he was never an artist who did much copying of other artists. In fact, I believe that the portrait of the artist's mother that he does is the only time he ever evokes another artist. But Tanner had trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He was a student in Philadelphia when Whistler's mother was shown there. He obviously paid a great deal of attention to it. But it was only 16 years later, when he is on a rare trip back to the U.S., he was living in Paris at the time, that he visits his parents in Kansas City. He makes two very conventional bust-length portraits of his parents, and then embarks on a second portrait of his mother, which is the one that sort of evokes Whistler's mother. And he does it in a very, I think, knowing way. In the upper left corner of the painting, you see the frame of a print, which is sort of perhaps the most telling quotation of Whistler's mother. He shows his own mother in profile, but she's in a rocking chair. She's dressed in a blue gown. There's this remarkable light shining on her face, and there's a tremendous warmth to the palette. So he's not gone with blacks and grays, but he's chosen these warmer browns. So he's very much reinterpreting Whistler, but using it on his own terms. Tanner, as it's been commented, was an artist whose entire career and his entire life, in some respects, was about navigating color relationships. So I think there's something so telling about the fact that he takes on Whistler in terms of the composition and the subject, but brings his own palette to it and his own sort of sense of movement to this rocking chair and the fan, so the light-colored shawl that trails off of the back of her chair. But the Tanner family was remarkably well-connected. They were really at the heart of Black intellectual life in the U.S., both in Philadelphia and Kansas City, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. So they would not have been lost on this comparison with Whistler. It was only a year after the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson, had upheld racial segregation in the United States and reaffirming separate but equal facilities and opportunities for Black and white citizens. So I think this is something of it's been called a gentle intellectual joke in the Tanner family, that taking on the Whistler's mother portrait, but doing it at a moment when Tanner had achieved great recognition in his own career. He was well established in Paris. The French state had just acquired his painting of the Resurrection of Lazarus. And so he had achieved the same mark of honor and privilege that Whistler had gotten 6 years earlier when Whistler's mother was acquired by the French state.
Jenny, thank you so much for telling us about it.
Thank you.
The Artist's Mother, Whistler and Philadelphia, is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art from the 10th of June until the 29th of October. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Amy Dawson, Julie Michalska and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Thom and Stanley, Wayne and Jenny. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit Christie's.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.